critical thinking will defrag your mind of propaganda-ridden viruses induced by mass media news programming. No BS here, just the facts.
And now we present to you America's quintessential iconoclastic anomaly. Wow. In talk radio, your host, Joe Cristiano.
Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Talk Radio, America's libertarian voice, broadcasting from our studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to around the world. I'm your host, Joe Cristiano, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. Today, we have Mr. Jason Pye, who's the Director of Messaging and the Director of Justice Reform at FreedomWorks. He will be discussing the state's abusiveness in civil asset forfeiture, or better known as the state's silent crime against its citizens for the enrichment of the well-connected, one of which I am not. Before joining FreedomWorks, Jason served as editor of United Liberty, a blog dedicated to promoting free markets, individual liberty, and limited government. Please join us by calling in with your questions or your comments, 646-652-4620. That's 646-652-4620 during our live broadcast. Welcome, Jason, to our program.
Hey, Joe, thanks for having me.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have you. You know, civil asset forfeiture is probably a subject which affects citizens directly. It's a heinous crime, and yet it gets the least amount of publicity, even as it is occurring in a particular a county or a city. It seems to be a minor issue, but in fact, it's an egregious affront to individual liberty, and we rarely hear anyone, especially now that the presidential election is coming up, you will not even hear a word about civil asset law forfeiture, mostly because if they did mention it, the populace would have no idea what they're talking about. Am I living on a different planet, or is that adequately describe one of the problems that we have with it?
I think you're adequately describing it. I mean, actually, just before I came on the air, I published a new blog post at FreedomWorks about a poll that YouGov released in August, and it showed that 72% of Americans, including 62% of Republicans, are not familiar with the term civil asset forfeiture. And and 40% believe that the government can permanently seize cash or property when the owner has been charged with or convicted of a crime. That's how they think of current civil asset forfeiture laws, or that's how they think it should work per se. But the polling reveals that not many people know about it. They don't know what it is. They don't know what's going on with it. They don't. And thankfully, we are seeing more stories of abuse come out in the media. We do have at least one or two presidential candidates who are concerned about civil asset forfeiture. They are talking about some aspects of criminal justice reform, which they spoke about in the last presidential debate, I believe a week ago yesterday. And so some of this is starting to come up in the media now that the clown show is starting to decline a little bit.
Right.
And we're starting to see some actual discussion of substantive policy issues. And I'm hoping that civil asset forfeiture, because you have Senator Paul and Senator Cruz, both of whom support reform, they're interested in the subject, and I think that they're going to be the ones who are the most likely to talk about it.
Okay. Well, of all the problems that this nation faces, all of the major issues that affect our individual liberties, why did you, or how did you wind up selecting civil asset forfeiture as one of your bulkheads?
Well, FreedomWorks is in the midst of a new project. It's actually a project that's been around since I believe February, but we started doing some groundwork on it before. We do see civil asset forfeiture as a civil liberties abuse. It undermines the Fifth Amendment. It undermines due process rights that are protected in the Fifth Amendment. And it's also a private property rights issue as well. So this is part of a bigger project that we call Justice for All at FreedomWorks. You can go to freedomworks.org/justice for all to see all the content on it. That we're promoting criminal justice reform, getting rid of mandatory minimum sentencing or reducing mandatory minimum sentences, and other aspects such as prison reform and reentry reform that will make communities safer. And particularly with civil asset forfeiture, because of the issues I already said, it's a property rights issue. It violates due process. And FreedomWorks believes that if you're going to go after the proceeds of criminal activity, you should convict someone of a crime. Otherwise, that person, under what has been traditional American law, is innocent until proven guilty. And so we believe that civil asset forfeiture should be treated as such. You either have to get a criminal conviction, or at the very least, you should have a higher standard of evidence that you use to subject property to forfeiture. And the burden of proof should always always be on the government, without question.
That in language that a person who is unfamiliar with civil asset forfeiture, could you describe what the real problem is, and if there were any instances where there was a sea change in the way it was interpreted as initially described in the Constitution, our right to property and freedom to possess what we own without forfeiture by the government, unless under certain circumstances. Could you give us some background and walk forward with it in language that a person that may be unfamiliar with that situation can understand?
Sure. No, civil asset forfeiture, and just to point out, I did recently write a publication for FreedomWorks on this. It's called From High Seas to Highway Robbery. And civil asset forfeiture, the way it was originally intended to be used was a maritime law. It was an admiralty law. It was used to enforce tariff collections and to combat smuggling. But over time, there were instances of use of civil asset forfeiture during the Civil War, as well as Prohibition era back in the 20s, when alcohol was outlawed. But more recently, it has been used to combat the war, as a tool to combat the war on drugs. And I think it was 1984, there was a crime bill that was passed that authorized the creation of the Justice Department's equitable sharing program, which basically this involves the state and local law enforcement can seize property and send it to the federal government for what they call adoption, and then receive up to 80% of the proceeds from that property back. No one has to be charged with a crime. No one has to be convicted of a crime. The innocent people can and are affected by civil asset forfeiture because there is no due process. It's handled in civil court, not criminal court. So to basically sum it up, the way it started, how it started, it has just been, it's the war on drugs. It's used as a tool to fight this war, which 81% or 82% of Americans believe we're losing. And after more than 4 decades, I believe, it's time to revisit the policies that aren't working, and the lives and livelihoods and monies that have been seized by the government. We need to bring that to an end. We need to be able to protect private property and protect due process rights. That's what this really is. It is a war on our civil liberties, and I think people more and more are becoming aware of that.
When people fight to protect their rights, are they winning or are they typically on the losing end? Do we have any statistics on that?
I don't have any statistics off the top of, that I can show you, but what I can say is that many people who do fight these battles, they lose, or they settle for they settle out of court with the government. There's a man who lives near where I live. I live near Atlanta, and this gentleman lives in Athens, Georgia, and his name is Andrew Clyde. And Andrew Clyde owns a gun store, and he was at the time doing very good business. I think this has been a few years ago, doing very good business, and he was making deposits of $10,000 or less, which is protected by his the deposits are protected by an insurance policy. And this is actually through the IRS. The IRS, they noticed the deposits. They seized his account worth something like $940,000 or $950,000. And after going back and forth with the IRS for months and months, probably I think it was up to 2 years that he fought this, he surrendered $50,000. The IRS kept $50,000 of his money. He was never charged with a crime. He was never convicted of a crime. But he still had to give up that $50,000, and then he spent another $100-something thousand on legal fees. And the hope is that I think a lot of prosecutors and especially prosecutors at the federal level hope to make people realize it's not worth the fight. At least what they see is not being worth the fight, because it's going to be too costly, and it's going to be a long, drawn-out process. And the way federal civil asset forfeiture law is constructed, there's a very low standard of evidence to subject property or money to forfeiture. It's what they call a preponderance of the evidence, or a 50% likelihood that the cash or property seized is connected to some sort of illicit activity, and the burden of proof falls on the innocent person,
right,
who may be the person who may be innocent.
Yeah.
And so he did settle. Others have been luckier. They have gotten they have gotten their money back, although they still were responsible for lawyers' fees, because under federal civil asset forfeiture law, you can't recover lawyers' fees in most instances. And so, a lot of people do. Some people do win, but most people give up or lose.
So that's interesting. The person whose assets have been absconded by the government actually pays the government to do that, because the government exists through its taxation process. So you are paying the government to abscond with your money, basically, your property. But when you have to fight the government to get your property back, you cannot recover your cost, but you have to pay the government cost. Yeah. When you look at it, that's tantamount to total insanity.
It really is. There's another case I can cite, and this one I'm not too familiar with, so I may mess it up here. But there's a gentleman who was driving through Nevada, somewhere in northern Nevada, and he had his. They pulled him over. They actually let him go because he refused to consent to a search, and he was pulled over again about 45 minutes later. And this was actually coordinated. It was coordinated between two different police officers, sheriff's deputies. And the second one pretty much insisted that he be allowed to search with a drug sniffing dog, and they seized, and I can't remember the dollar amount, but I want to say it was over $100,000. He eventually won. He won his case in federal court on a technicality. The prosecutor wasn't upfront with the judge, and the judge didn't like that too much about how it all went down, especially the coordination between the two officers. Right. So that they let him go. But the prosecutor he motioned or begged the judge not to or give lawyers' fees to the person who had their property taken, and they're actually appealing the decision of the judge, and it's going to go up to, I believe, a court of appeals now. So even when someone does win, the prosecutors can fight back in some ways, and they'll basically just appeal it until you give up. I think this gentleman spent something along the lines of almost what the cash that was taken was worth, right, to fight this, and he's obviously he wants his lawyer's fees because that's a huge chunk of change. So we there are other instances as well. There are a couple cases that are working through the federal government right now, federal court process right now. A young man by the name of Joseph Rivers, who had his property taken, or cash, $16,000 in cash taken when he was on an Amtrak train in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They didn't believe his story. He even called his mother to get his mother to corroborate his story. And the DEA agents who boarded the bus, and he feels singled him out because he is a young African-American male, they still took the money anyway, and he's fighting. I believe the Institute for Justice is representing him. There's another young man by the name of Charles Clark who had something like $16,000 or $12,000, I think it was, seized, and the Institute for Justice is representing him as well in federal court. So they're, thankfully the IJ, the Institute for Justice, does exist because they're doing this pro bono. They don't ask for lawyers' fees or anything like
right.
that. So
I support those organizations, the Institute of Justice. I send them donation from time to time because I know they do excellent work. But it's awfully strange. I guess from the other side, talking from the dark side, what is a guy on a bus doing with $16,000 in his pocket? I guess that's got to raise some suspicion, and that's no reason to take the money. I realize that, and I recognize that.
Well, carrying cash, and Joe, carrying cash is not a crime.
Right, I agree with you. But I often wonder. Where was the guy's head saying, right, I'm going to carry $16,000 in my pocket and get on a bus? Well, I can get mugged.
No, absolutely. And Joseph Rivers' case, he was from Michigan. He had saved up money, $16,000, to get in the music industry. I think he wanted to make a music video, and he was on his way to Los Angeles by train to fulfill his lifelong dream of making a music video. His family helped him save. These are savings of his own that he spent his life working for. And, that's what he was doing. He was going to fulfill his dream, and his dream has been stalled. Now, I do believe he has raised some money through like a GoFundMe or a Kickstarter to replace the money that was taken. And I believe he even got invited by one record company to make his own music video at no cost.
Well, good for him.
Good for him. Yeah, absolutely. And I had I had the opportunity to meet him back in June. I participated on a panel on civil asset forfeiture hosted by Right on Crime at Americans for Tax Reform's headquarters, and he spoke on the panel after mine. I tell you, that kid Joseph Rivers, he's smart. He unfortunately has had to learn about this firsthand, but I think just the intelligence that he showed and what he knew about civil asset forfeiture in just a little bit of time, that since I think this happened to him back in April or March or something like that. The kid knows his stuff, and I think he could rival any one of us, even people who work in this space on a regular occasion. He could rival our intelligence on this stuff because he knows what he's talking about.
Well, why did they pick him? Why did they single him out? Just because he was riding a bus? I mean, there was no provocation whatsoever. So why they just get on there and say, "What? There's a young black guy. We have to search him." I mean, is that what happened?
That's what Joseph believes. That's what Mr. Rivers says. He believes he was singled out because of his race. And there are, while I tend not to focus on the color of a victim, of a civil asset forfeiture victim, their race. I tend to focus on the policy itself. But there are studies and research that show that this does tend to affect minorities more than it affects someone like you or I. And there's a study, the American Civil Liberties Union of Pennsylvania recently released a report out of that focused on Philadelphia that shows it is predominantly minority communities where civil asset forfeiture takes place the most.
Now, is also a private property part of the civil asset forfeiture problem? For example, if I own a house on a street on a busy street corner, and I decide, someone decides, hey, this would be a great place for a convenience store or a shopping center, they can take it and declare it theirs because it's obviously there's money to be made by the city or the county by doing so, and I have no right to that property any longer. Is that part of civil asset forfeiture, or is that a different problem altogether?
Well, I think you're referring to eminent domain.
Eminent domain. That's what I was thinking of. Okay.
Well, but let me say this, because and I wrote a blog post about this yesterday, and the title of it being "Civil Asset Forfeiture is Inconsistent with Economic Freedom."
Right.
I mean, let's be honest here. I mean, as libertarians, I think, and it's people who believe in free market capitalism, that we believe that the most basic human and the basic fundamental and human right is the right to property. The right to trade it, the right to sell it, the right to do with it as we please, as long as we're not harming anybody else in the process of it. The John Stuart Mill's the harm principle really does apply to libertarians. We believe that very much. So yeah, I mean, I think there is an aspect here that it does hurt. It does trip on that right to property, just as eminent domain trips on that right to property. The idea that government can come in and take your property for some sort of economic development purpose, the robbing Peter to pay Paul, which is what happens with eminent domain. They're taking from the Kelo case in 2005, for example, but they're taking from one private person to give to another private person or a private business. That's wrong. That fundamentally violates what we believe in the Fifth Amendment. Even the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment says it's for public use, but public use has been redefined to, virtually anything. I mean, anything that involves increasing tax bases. And civil asset forfeiture, because of the perverse profit motive that exists, can be viewed the same way. I'm not saying exactly the same, but it can be viewed the same way because a lot of states allow law enforcement to keep either part or all of the proceeds from forfeitures, creating a perverse profit motive that they have, because they have an incentive to self-fund. They tend to focus on it rather than doing things that protect the public safety, investigating crimes or stopping crimes, things like that.
You would think that if you went into a very high crime area and the police had reason to believe that there was some criminal activity going on, they broke into someone's apartment or knocked on the door, went in and found $4.5 million in $20 bills hanging around, you'd say, well, that would be highly suspicious, and you would probably take possession of that money until you found out what was going on, because that would be highly unusual and an indication that there's drug running money. But in the cases that you're citing, these seem to be plain vanilla, everyday people with relatively small amounts of money, transacting business openly on the open market, not hiding anything, and yet they're still subject to this forfeiture. And that's what I find absolutely alarming.
Yeah, no, I do too, and I mean, it bothers me because, and I'll tell you, like when I was appointed to run this project at FreedomWorks, I think one of the things I was already familiar with some of these issues, but I never did a lot of in-depth, study on them. I previously, before running FreedomWorks, or before running this project at FreedomWorks, and before running United Liberty, I worked for a former member of Congress. I did research and did some writing for him, and he was really interested in these issues, he had me do some work on them. But when I got involved with it at FreedomWorks, the power. There's a lot of power in storytelling. Highlighting the Joseph Rivers or the Charles Clarks or the Andrew Clydes, those who have been those innocent people who have been impacted negatively by civil asset forfeiture, and and those are not the only three examples. There are many others that I could I'd have to look them up, but I can give to you. But there are these stories. They're compelling and they're frightening that your government can do something like this. The title of this segment today, the state's crimes against people. That's really what it is. I mean, it is. This is legalized theft, and if you want to take away the proceeds and the profits from illicit activity, get a conviction. That's how due process is supposed to work. Yeah. That's how our system was set up, and I got to think that the founding fathers. Not just on civil asset forfeiture, but in a wide array of issues, they're rolling over in their graves at this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Well, why do you think we have elected officials that are constantly running for office? They're conscious of this. I mean, they recognize the illegality and the unfairness of it all. Why aren't these clowns up in arms about this? And why has it taken so long for them to even recognize that it is a problem? They should have done something about this 30 years ago. What's taking so long? I mean, you don't have to be a Harvard business graduate in this, to understand. I mean, even some street kid from Harlem, can understand this. This is rocket science stuff. It's very simple. I've read many briefs on civil asset forfeiture, and they are difficult to read because you get so angry by the time you're finished. You haven't spoiled your evening. You've spoiled your week. Because you can't get out of your head. And now I'm sure these I don't know if they call them congressmen, clowns, or criminals that are in our elected office. I mean, they know this. They have people who are reading these things, giving them advice. What's taking them so long? How do we kick them in a rump to get them started?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, and let me preface this answer by saying that my father was a police officer. He served for somewhere along the lines of 8 to 10 years between two police departments in Metro Atlanta, including the Atlanta Police Department. So let me say this, what I'm about to say, by prefacing it with that. But a lot of it has to do with law enforcement. They lobby hard against these bills. You have in California, for example, a civil asset forfeiture bill that would have dealt with the federal government's equitable sharing program. It would have required law enforcement to abide by state law when going after property. Basically, they could not receive the proceeds until they had a criminal conviction. So they fought against that bill. It passed the Senate with only one dissenting vote. But momentum built, and it swung on the side of law enforcement, and they were able to kill it in the state assembly. So you have law enforcement on one side because they don't want that profit motive to go away, or that profit incentive to go away, because they fund their operations, they fund other activities such as buying margarita machines, tickets to concerts, and those are actual examples of spending with forfeiture funds. But so that's one part of it, and a lot of it, and I would like to think that this is the main cause of it, is that a lot of members of Congress, a lot of lawmakers really just they don't know that much about it. One of our former interns, I recall him telling me that he bumped into one of his senators, I think both of his senators actually, from his home state, and they had no idea what civil asset forfeiture was. And
oh God! Don't say that, please. I wasn't feeling well before. At my age, you have to be very sensitive. I'm a very delicate guy.
No, I understand. I'm sorry to bring it up, but I understand. But but I think at Congress you have the focus has been largely on wedge issues right now. Especially in the last few months, it's been on wedge issues and other concerns such as the Iran deal and the budget, the continuing resolution that's likely to come up here in just a few days. So those are issues that are dominating the discussion on Capitol Hill right now. But I think if you want to see reform, you need to contact your state legislature. You need your representatives at the state level. That's who you need to talk to right now, because that's where, and we're coming up, and I know in Oklahoma, for example, Senator Kyle Loveless has been very active on civil asset forfeiture. He's introduced what is a very good bill, in my opinion, to reform civil asset forfeiture. But again, law enforcement is not just fighting against it; they're using hyperbole, vicious, angry, fear-mongering attacks against the senator and against his bill. Which are completely unfounded and completely false, by the way. They're going after him hard. So but I think next year in January, when a lot of state legislatures start coming back into session, we're going to see a lot more civil asset forfeiture reform bills that are going to be introduced. And organizations like FreedomWorks and there's a C4 that we work with called Fix Forfeiture in the U.S. Justice Action Network. We're a partner of those two organizations. We're going to be joining with them to fight for reform in these state legislatures. And I think other organizations that we work with in this effort, such as Americans for Tax Reform, the Faith and Freedom Coalition, and Right on Crime, we're going to be standing right there with them. They're going to be standing right there with us, and we're going to be fighting for reform wherever we can, in any state we can.
Well, you mentioned the law enforcement lobbying, and basically when we say lobbying, we mean we want you to do it our way, not the right way. And I think our elected officials should be able to see through that. Unfortunately, they're highly influenced by that, and that's another thing that grabs me. Well, if we ended the war on drugs, would that have a significant impact on civil asset forfeiture?
I don't want to get too much in the weeds on the war on drugs, because I will say this as someone, and FreedomWorks takes no position on any sort of drug legalization or decriminalization. But I think that from our perspective, drugs should be treated more as a health issue.
Right.
An addiction, and that rehabilitation, drug treatment, and for those who do serve time, work training, education, and other programs should be available to both lessen the reliance on incarceration, as well as to make communities safer. Because if you're targeting that, what we call recidivism, which is the rate of repeat offenses or recidivist behavior over 3 years, you're saving money and you're reducing crime, right, and you're making the system a lot better off and making it work for everybody. Thankfully, there are efforts to see that aspect of criminal justice reform actually to get that change. We're expecting legislation in the United States Senate any day now. And a lot of states, including Oklahoma, for example, they recently enacted what they call a safety valve exception to mandatory minimum sentences, where judges can sentence more on like a case-by-case basis rather than just arbitrarily throwing them in jail 4, 5, 10, 15, 35 years or life in some cases for nonviolent first time, sometimes low level, or maybe even a couple repeat offenses, just so they can straighten them out. And if they continue to be a problem, we can go ahead and we can look at a little bit more lengthy or harsher sentences. But I think that the war on drugs has had a disproportionate impact on certain communities in the United States. I think it has been largely infringed on our civil liberties in many instances through things that, like civil asset forfeiture, through certain police tactics such as no-knock warrants, for example. I think that we have to take a hard look at the war on drugs and how it is impacting people negatively, and begin to revisit some of those policies. Yeah, that's how I view it, and I think that's largely how FreedomWorks views it. And I think that we are seeing some efforts, some slow efforts, because we're making sausage here. Unfortunately, that's just the case, and we have to address all concerns to reach something that all sides can live with. But I'm optimistic that we're going to see some big changes here soon on all aspects of criminal justice reform at the state level and possibly even at the federal level. And that our communities will be safer because of it. And as we've shown, despite the fact this frequent concern that violent crime is on the rise. I mean, if you look at crime rates over the last 20 years, they've declined substantially.
Absolutely, yeah.
And and that's not because we're locking more people up. That's because of socioeconomic changes. That's because of people are generally better off than they were 20, 25 years ago. But and there's a study by the Brannon Center for Justice that backs that up. If anybody wants to contact me, that you're from any listeners you have, I'll be happy to send it to them so they can look it over themselves. But I think that there's a sea change, and I think it's coming from the ground up. I think our activists see that things have to change. They still want to hold people who break the law accountable, but we have to take a different approach in the way we hold them accountable.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I had mentioned the war on drugs is because so many of these programs that the government initiates, such as the war on drugs, has these unintended consequences. Civil asset forfeiture, I'm sure, was in no one's head when they enacted this thing, but yet it's a natural product of this, and it affects so many, just like the war on drugs affects our immigration policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to get to the war on drugs. I'm
Sure.
just saying that we have to be very careful whenever we enact one piece of restrictive legislation and how it affects unrelated other activities, which then reduces our individual liberties. And we don't seem to ever take that approach. And anyway, well, now that I've proselytized on that, but...
No. If you don't mind, I would like to, I would like to point out something here, that there was actually a reform bill in 2000 or 2001. It was Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform. We call it CAFRA, the Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform Act of 2000. And it was supposed to address civil asset forfeiture, which, this abuse is not new. It's just that, the news cycle being what it is today, and we can get news in an instant through Facebook and Twitter and so on, medias that didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's becoming more, awareness is being raised to it. But, civil asset forfeiture was supposed to, CAFRA was supposed to, fix federal civil asset forfeiture law. Unfortunately, as we can see, it didn't do that. And I wrote from High Seas to Highway Forfeiture. I quoted former Congressman Bob Barr, who's a Republican from my home state, Georgia. And he noted that actually CAFRA was initially successful. He says that the first year following CAFRA's passage, the federal government did witness a significant drop in the value of assets seized from nearly $313 million in the year 2000 to just under $200 million in 2001. But he also noted that the success didn't last. As ever, Uncle Sam has moved aggressively to make up the difference in recent years, raking in more than $1 billion in forfeited civil assets in 2013 alone. You can go look at the year by year, and we do note this in that publication from High Seas to Highway Robbery. You can see how federal the assets seized through federal civil asset forfeiture law have just grown and grown and grown. I mean, just in the last 4 or 5 years alone, we're talking something like $6 billion in seized assets that have come into the federal government coffers, the Justice Department's assets forfeiture fund. And they've paid out, hundreds of millions of dollars each year back to state and local law enforcement.
Well, I'm sorry, again.
No, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was just wondering, it just always seems whenever we take one step forward, eventually the government ramps up their end of the program, and we wind up taking 3 steps backwards. And it really bothers me because we have to fight to make progress, but the net over a certain number of years is that we lose even more ground. It seems like we can, every citizen in the United States can spend most of their time fighting the government on all of these abusive laws and actions, and we would still lose ground. I mean, it's psychologically, that's the way I feel, and it just aggravates me that we can't make progress and it stays there. It always seems that the government hires more people, more lawyers, more whatever, gets more people involved, and of course they charge us for it, and then we lose even more rights than we had in the first place. We would have been better off doing nothing. And I know that's a very defeatist attitude, but I guess at my age, I'm getting kind of cynical about this whole thing. Jason, could you hold on for about a minute and a half for station identification? Will you stay with us, please?
Absolutely.
All right, please hold on. Folks, don't go away. We're going to break for station identification. Just 1 minute, please, and stay with us, and we'll be right back. Thank you.
You're listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Political talk derived from a historical perspective. Not always palatable, but good food for thought. Pure libertarian talk with host Joe Cristiano. LibertyTalkRadio.com.
Express Test is your go-to company for on-site occupational health testing services. That's right, we said on-site. That means we will meet you at your facility for a free health and occupational safety consultation. Express Test specializes in hearing conservation, respiratory protection, and employee safety. We can help you establish viable programs tailored to your business and employee needs. For your free consultation, call 918-743-2929 or visit us at expresstest.com. That's 918-743-2929 or expresstest.com. Do you find yourself asking, what did you say? Aaron Cristiano of Ranch Acres Audiology has over 25 years of experience helping patients just like you.
Hearing requires conservation. We need to be aware and we need to be responsible for our own hearing health.
Understand more with a little help from Ranch Acres Audiology. Call 918-749-7711. That's 918-749-7711 to learn more. We'd like to thank attorney Constance Squires for her support of Liberty Talk Radio. If you want a comprehensive way to affordably avoid legal issues, call Constance Squires. For a free consultation, call 918-254-9283 or go online at isthyWillDone.com.
Steve Harden of the Harden Insurance Agency has over 30 years of experience designing family insurance protection, including retirement planning. Call 918-488-0024 or go to hardenagency.com and request a free in-depth estate and retirement evaluation. We look forward to earning your trust and helping you meet your life goals.
This isn't your typical talk radio show. This is Liberty. Liberty Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Joe Cristiano, the Liberty Talk Radio. We will have with us today Mr. Jason Pye, is a Director of Messaging and the Director of Justice Reform for FreedomWorks. We're talking about civil asset forfeiture, and my blood pressure is going up, and I think I'm going to be taken to the hospital.
My blood pressure is going up.
Now.
I mean, I can't even produce this show right now.
My board operator can't even take this. What have you done to us, Jason? I mean, you're going to be responsible for some health issues here. But are there any states that are more on the side of individual liberties and are basically on our side, and versus others? I mean, I'm sure not every state is equal. Are there any good states and are there any bad states?
Well, sure. No, and FreedomWorks recently released, I think back in June, it's called Civil Asset Forfeiture Grading the States. We did basically a 50-state scorecard plus the District of Columbia, and we looked at each state based on a few different criteria. The standard of evidence needed to subject property to forfeiture, where does the burden of proof fall, what amount of proceeds does law enforcement get to keep. We found that there are a handful of good states. I think we graded 4 with either an A or a B. New Mexico is the best. They require a criminal conviction before property can be forfeited to the government. They remove the profit incentive. So and obviously in criminal convictions, the burden of proof falls on the government. So it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And then there's also North Carolina, which has no civil asset forfeiture laws. So they got an A-. And then Montana, we gave them a B because they require a criminal conviction. And then Minnesota has, I think it's either a B or a B+. I can't tell because the font's too small on my computer here. But sorry about that. We gave them a B+. B+ for Montana, B+
good for Montana.
Minnesota. And so those 4 states require criminal convictions before property can be seized or forfeited to the state. So those states did the best. And and not all of them are equally the best. I mean, New Mexico's new civil asset forfeiture law, which was enacted back in April, and FreedomWorks drove 5,000 calls to Governor Susana Martinez's office, urging her to sign that bill into law because we heard that she was hedging on it, that she was probably going to pocket veto it, just not actually go outright veto it, just let the time expire she needed to just automatically veto the bill. Thankfully, our calls, as well as the efforts of other organizations and people involved, she did sign the bill into law. But that law is probably the model. A lot of people have been talking about the New Mexico model. That bill is so comprehensive, that new law is so comprehensive that it not only requires criminal conviction and gets rid of the profit motive. And by getting rid of the profit motive, they're directing all the proceeds from forfeiture into the state's general fund. It also targeted what we call the loophole, which allows the state and local law enforcement to send seized property and cash to the federal government for adoption. It completely outlawed that, which is unique in a lot of ways. So those 4 states are the best, and then we can talk about the worst if you want to as well.
Which is the worst? That's the next question. And then I'm going to ask you, where does Oklahoma fit, since I'm in Oklahoma?
Sure. So there are actually several states that received Fs. Alaska, Washington, Wyoming, South Dakota, Alabama, South Carolina, and Rhode Island all received Fs on our scorecard.
Wow.
Which, yeah.
I'm surprised Wyoming's up. I thought Wyoming would be probably get a pretty high mark. It's really surprising.
Well, their grade would have been better if Governor Matt Mead hadn't vetoed a civil asset forfeiture reform bill very, very similar to the one that passed Montana requiring a criminal conviction. But he, being a former U.S. prosecutor, vetoed the bill, I believe, back in late February or early March. But they're going to try again this next session, is my understanding. They've been working on legislation already here in the interim between sessions to go back and revisit the issue. Oklahoma received a D-.
Well, we know, lukewarm nowhere, typical state, Okay. I'm not very happy with that, but.
Well, I'm not either, and neither is Senator Loveless, thankfully. And he's, like I said, he's working to fix it. But your burden of proof in Oklahoma is too low. It's only a preponderance of the evidence, which again is a 50% likelihood that the property seized is connected to some sort of illicit activity. And the burden is on the property owner. He has to prove his innocence to get his property back. And again, he doesn't have to be charged with a crime. And law enforcement, be it sheriffs or local police departments or prosecutors, can keep up to 100% of the forfeiture funds.
Right. Right. Now, is there a difference in political persuasion regarding civil asset forfeiture? For example, is one party more pro or con than the other? Is there any sort of coalition anywhere within our political system?
What I've found generally across the board, and when we're talking about the war on drug style policies, they've traditionally been bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats pretty much evenly support them, perhaps more on the Republican side. I know that the 1984 crime bill was passed by a Democratic Congress and signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. It's one of the few black marks on Reagan's record, in my opinion. But in terms of Oklahoma, it's mostly Republicans fighting this. And in California, it was bipartisan. When they killed that bill in the state assembly, it was bipartisan the way it was killed.
When you say fighting this, I'm sorry.
They're fighting. I'm sorry, fighting reform.
We're fighting reform. Okay.
Right.
I see. All right.
Yeah.
And now, which states are you working most ardently right now in?
Sure. No, the ones we're paying attention to very closely right now are Oklahoma for obvious reasons, because Senator Loveless has introduced his bill and we're trying to help him. Actually testified on a panel he hosted earlier this month, in favor of reform. Didn't really go in detail to his bill specifically. I just talked about the problems with Oklahoma law. Right. So Oklahoma is on FreedomWorks radar as well as the radar of other organizations. There are other states. Pennsylvania has civil asset forfeiture laws working through their legislature right now, a very New Mexico style bill. Michigan has a package of reforms that they're not quite New Mexico. They don't require a criminal conviction, but they do raise the standard of evidence. In Michigan, they also Michigan's quite unique because the burden of proof already falls on the government. So, but raising the standard of evidence is very important. It goes from that preponderance, which is the 50% likelihood, to clear and convincing, which is more likely to be true than false. Those are states, and then there's Ohio as well, which we're looking at. There's going to be a civil asset forfeiture reform bill introduced here very soon. I believe I'll be up there on Tuesday and to speak in favor of that bill. And then states like Georgia, we would like to see some more action in Georgia, which again is my home state. I live in Georgia, so we're wanting to see some action there. The reform bill they passed this past year in the most recent legislative session didn't really do anything. There are no real substantive protection for innocent property owners. And then there are a couple other states as well that may circle on our radar. Arizona being one of them. There's the Attorney General in Arizona has spoken in favor of reform. He's a Republican. The American Civil Liberties Union chapter in Arizona has filed a lawsuit against the state on the grounds that civil asset forfeiture laws in that state are unconstitutional. So, and which is absolutely correct, I'm sure, in both of our opinions, definitely mine. So those are the states that we're looking at right now. We may add some more in, just depending on what pieces of legislation are introduced in the next year's legislative sessions.
Are there any changes that could be made to existing programs? I mentioned the war on drugs, that's one. That if there were changes in these other programs, it would affect the civil asset forfeiture situation that exists today?
Yeah, no, there are. I mean, in terms of civil asset forfeiture at the federal level, the equitable sharing program, there can be changes in state laws, especially laws with more protective civil asset forfeiture laws, protective in terms of protecting the innocent. That would, like the one that was recently unfortunately shot down in California, that would have closed that loophole that allows state and local law enforcement to send property to the federal government for adoption. Tweaks have been made to that, but the tweaks weren't nearly enough. And it was one of the few things Attorney General Eric Holder got right. By tweaking civil asset forfeiture laws. Unfortunately, the new Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, she's called civil asset forfeiture a quote-unquote wonderful tool, in her being a former federal prosecutor. But there are tweaks that can be made to federal law. One of the big ones come through what we call the FAIR Act. It's Senator Rand Paul and Congressman Tim Walberg's bill. It's the Fifth Amendment Integrity Restoration Act. That's a bit of a tongue twister.
Wow, that is a tough one. I could not get that out. I applaud you for that.
Thank you. This bill, the FAIR Act. The FAIR Act raises the standard of evidence in federal forfeiture cases from preponderance to clear and convincing. It puts the burden of proof on the federal government, so federal prosecutors would have to actually prove what they're doing is they have to prove that the person owned property that was connected to a crime rather than the other way around as it currently exists. It would also target the equitable sharing program in a very unique way. Basically, equitable sharing would completely come to an end, because it would direct proceeds from forfeitures prosecuted under federal law or conducted under federal law into the Treasury Department's general fund. So that takes away the profit motive. That takes away the profit incentive. And then a lot of state laws are, as I know, they're going after it as well through equitable sharing. There are other pieces of legislation that are rumored at the federal level that would also target equitable sharing. We saw a draft of a bill that was introduced, and I won't say the senator's name, but it was a very good bill, and we were just waiting for it to be introduced. Unfortunately, he got distracted with another criminal justice reform priority. So his bill was not quite as good as the FAIR Act, but still very good. And it would have done many of the same things. So, and if that's revisited, and if there are no substantive tweaks to that bill, if he introduces it, we'll do a letter of support for it as well.
Yeah. Now, from what I understand, if you are wrongfully convicted of not convicted, but if your assets are absconded by the government, and then you're found innocent of any crime, you can't go to the government and sue them for time lost, business loss, any loss involved. You cannot go to the government and sue the government and saying, hey, I'm going to sue the government for wrongfully taking my property and taking me away from my business, and this cost me $200,000, and I'm going to sue for $500,000. Is that possible, or is that off the table altogether?
There's a gentleman in North Carolina, and you'll have to give me a moment while I look up his name. But he's a convenience store owner, and he had, I believe, something like $120,000 seized from his bank account because of the same issue, structuring. It was actually, oddly enough, and this is how little people know about it. His bank teller was actually the one who told him to make bank transactions under $10,000, because if you make a transaction, a cash deposit over $10,000, the bank has to report it under the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970. So he just did this, thinking it was okay, and then his money got taken. So thankfully, this particular business owner, whose name I will have for you in just a moment, he fought the federal government. He won. It was $107,000, and his name is last name is McClellan. I see that much, and for some reason Lyndon McClellan. That's his name. So he fought the federal government. He won the case. They actually withdrew the case. They dropped the case, and he was represented by the Institute for Justice here again. And this case is actually pretty interesting because they tried to bully him and threaten him and intimidate him to just settle with the federal government. The assistant U.S. attorney, whose name is Steve West, based in North Carolina, he told McClellan's lawyer that he needs to resolve this or litigate, but publicity about it doesn't help. It just ratchets up feelings within the agency. My offer is to return 50% of the money. The offer is good until March 30th at close of business.
What, 50% of the money? Why not all of it?
50% of the money.
But why not all of it if he's innocent?
Hey, I'm right there with you, man.
That's insane. I mean, I would never take that. I would go. I tell you, I would go to my grave fighting this thing. I mean, underground, you'd still hear the rumbles. I would never stop.
No, I mean, I'm right there with you. But he did, because they the reason they withdrew the case is because there was another change done by former Attorney General Eric Holder, then Attorney General Holder, that they stopped going after these cases that only involve structuring offenses. Structuring is again the $10,000 either above or below frequent transactions. So they stopped prosecuting that where structuring was the only offense. So basically, you had to have another criminal offense alleged in the case before you could go after the money. So this particular assistant attorney finally got that memo, and so he withdrew it. But still, Mr. McClellan spent $3,000 to hire an attorney to fight the seizure, and he spent another $19,000 for an accountant to conduct an audit of his financial records. So he's out that $22,000. But he's trying to sue the federal government right now to get the $22,000 back, as well as interest on the cash that he lost.
Right, justifiably so, and a lot more than that.
Right.
I mean, just the aggravation involved. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd say go for $250,000. I'm backing him.
Well, no. Hey, look, I agree with you, and hopefully I think IJ is handling that case as well. But this is but he's kudos to him, because he has the cojones to go after the federal government where most people wouldn't, and
right.
And it's really to his credit that he's doing that. So he's, especially since he won, especially since they withdrew, it seems only logical that they would give him the money back plus interest plus anything he spent.
Yeah, I mean, why can't the government just be fair about it? I mean, What is the logic of giving back to only 50%? I mean, what's the logic there? Why 50%? Why not 110%?
Well, that's how they. I mean, and again, I want to make it clear: he did get all the money back. The original money that was taken. He did not settle. He won. He won because they withdrew. But with that said, settlement in civil asset forfeiture cases, settlement is really another tool in their arsenal. They will wait you out until you just say, "Fine, I've had enough. Take half my money. Take whatever you want as your fee. Just give me the rest back."
But even if you're innocent, you can take half my money.
That's and that's what and that's what Andrew Clyde did. Andrew Clyde, this guy, an Iraq War veteran, He served his country faithfully, proudly. He's an honest businessman. He never did anything wrong. They never charged him with a crime. $940,000 taken from him, and he got most of it back, with the exception of his $100,000 in lawyers' fees and the $50,000 he spent to settle the case. He called the $50,000 a tactical retreat because he has staked his public life, his personal life, on going after and trying to fix federal civil asset forfeiture laws. I had the opportunity to speak to him on the phone, and I can tell you, this guy, he's pissed, to put it frankly. Excuse my language. He's upset. He's understandably upset.
Oh, I would go nuts. I mean, I don't know how I wouldn't sleep at night. I'd be a basket case.
You got me. For me, I'm the type of person that if I get thrown off my game just a little bit, it really messes me up. I'm like, oh, why did that happen? It shakes me up a little bit. I can only imagine what must have been going through his mind when $940,000 was wrongfully taken from him. I mean, I don't know what I would do, and this put his livelihood at complete risk. And thankfully, he in some of these cases I've read about, Mr. Clyde had the opportunity to speak at back in February. There was a panel, a hearing on the Hill. It was a House Ways and Means subcommittee. He joined two other business owners who had been wrongfully targeted by the IRS and federal prosecutors. One of the gentlemen who was involved, who testified, ironically enough, the prosecuting federal attorney, or the federal attorney who was handling the case, was Loretta Lynch. And very quietly, he got his money back when during her confirmation hearings.
Oh, I see. Very good. All right. Well, from now on, I am never withdrawing or transferring more than $20 out of any of my accounts. Well, first of all, I don't have much more money than that, so I don't have a problem doing that.
Yeah, I mean, all of my all of my transactions are under $10,000, and they're nowhere near that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Okay, well, where do you see this thing going? I mean, what's the end game here? We have about 4 more minutes, and maybe you can wrap it up by telling us what you're doing now, where you see it going, and anything else you'd like to tell our audience.
Sure. Well, civil asset, we're tracking everything on the criminal justice reform issues on the Hill and in the states. We're looking for reforms that protect innocent property owners, obviously, in terms of civil asset forfeiture, and we're tracking reforms for general criminal justice that will save taxpayers money, reduce recidivism, and make communities safer. So I think that's what we're doing, and we're optimistic, especially at the federal level, for general criminal justice reform, and then at the state level, we're seeing movement and momentum at the states, given just the interest in the topic over the last year. What I've seen, just growing, skyrocketing interest, and I think that's going to continue in the 2016 state legislative sessions. And so we hope to be involved, and we will be involved in as many of these states as we possibly can. We're going to be continuing to educate our activists on these issues, explaining to them why they should support civil asset forfeiture reform, both as a constitutional issue, due process, Fifth Amendment, and as well as a private property rights issue. And so I'm optimistic, and I think we're going to see some things happen, and FreedomWorks will be standing strong and in working alongside any allied organization or any allied legislator who wants to work with us. We're going to be working on these issues, even if we're the only ones standing there. We won't be, thankfully, again, because we have Fix Forfeiture and a lot of these other groups like Americans for Tax Reform and Faith and Freedom and Right on Crime, who are going to be standing right there with us. But we want to see reform that lives up to what we believe in, which is limited government and individual liberties and free markets. And I think you've hit a couple nails on the head in terms of it being a property rights issue today, and even comparing it to eminent domain, because again, as libertarians, we believe in free market capitalism, and there is no more basic and fundamental right than the right to property.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Rand Paul is probably the strongest one, ardent supporter of civil asset forfeiture reform, or is he the strongest one, or is there anyone that's
Sure. No, there are a few. You have Senator Paul, who has spoken, who's introduced legislation in favor of reform. Senator Ted Cruz, who has spoken in favor of reform. I believe he has co-sponsored some legislation. I don't remember. I think he may be a co-sponsor on the FAIR Act. I'm not sure. Senator Marco Rubio has spoken out in favor of civil asset forfeiture reform. As far as the other contenders, I'm not real sure, because some of them do take traditionally tough on crime stances. You have, and I don't want to put words in anybody's mouths, but you can look at their backgrounds and see, such as the Chris Christie, who's a former federal prosecutor. It's something he very vocally talks about. And then we don't know where some other candidates stand, such as Carly Fiorina or the aforementioned clown that we talk about. We don't know where he stands on some of these issues either. So, I mean, I'm waiting, and FreedomWorks will be engaging any presidential candidate we can on these issues, and hopefully we'll see more of them come out in support of civil asset forfeiture reform.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that the American public has become just generally so ignorant of all of these issues. And if I avoid watching mainstream television, even radio, when I'm driving, but the times that I do, I just after 2 minutes, I say I can't take this anymore, because this is what the average American is listening to and actually absorbing and thinking it's important to talk about these nonsense issues, where the important issues are very rarely addressed. Well, Jason, I want to thank you so much for being on our program. Our hour is just about up. You've been an absolutely terrific guest. I hope you will accept our invitation to return and give us some update at a later date. Right?
Absolutely.
And if you'd like to, the last 30 seconds to tell our audience how they may contact you or support your efforts.
Sure. You can find what I'm writing about at freedomworks.org/justiceforall, or you can just check out any of the content we produce at freedomworks.org. You can contact me on Twitter at Pye, P-Y-E. And then I have a Facebook page. It's facebook.com/LibertyPie. And you can also email me at jpie@freedomworks.org. I think I've covered all the bases. But no, again, Joe, thank you for having me on today. I've enjoyed it. And anytime you want me to come back, just let me know. If I'm able, I'll be on.
Thank you so much, and stay in touch. Okay.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, folks, this is the end of today's program. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, as my wife used to say, as always says, you are either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well, stay tuned.